Hey, everybody. Welcome back to the Live Ultralight podcast. Today, we have a very special guest, Andrew Stevens, or Steven. And he's a podcast host on a different podcast that's exceptional. I started to listen to it. Really, really liked it. Really excited to have him on the podcast. But if you're just tuning into the Live Ultralight podcast for the first time, on this podcast, we are in the business of helping you get out on the trail more comfortably and more confidently, help you eliminate some of those unknowns, get inspired, and just spend more time out on the trail. So really glad to have you on here. I would describe you, Andrew, after listening to a few of your podcasts, as an excellent storyteller. I think you've got a phenomenal way of telling a story. Your voice is very soothing. I wish my voice is as soothing as yours to be a host on a podcast. But,
I think your voice is wonderful.
And yeah, I really, really enjoyed it. Now, the podcast that you host is called Trail Weight. And I think there's some double meanings and things inside there that we'll get into. But I really want to dive back into just your origin story with backpacking, because I think we have followers that will really connect with that. And I think there's a lot of interesting tidbits in there of just like why you made some of these changes. And so essentially, and correct me where I'm wrong, you were creeping up on nearly 400 pounds in weight. You were feeling like you were physically not where you wanted to be, and maybe mentally as well. And if I'm inferring here, again, just cut me off and say, no, I was doing great. But I find often, for me at least, that those two can go hand in hand. And you decided to just go out and do something crazy and essentially put it in the calendar that you were going to do the JMT, the John Muir Trail, which is a 200-mile long trail through the high countries, Sierra Mountains. So if it's a big task, a phenomenal task, and something that would probably feel unrealistic to someone sitting in your scenario. So I guess my first question to you is why? Like, where did this come from, and why did you decide to set that as a goal and embark on that?
Totally. Well, first, just thank you so much for having me on the show. I love talking about this stuff, so I'm excited to, connect with a fellow enthusiast. But backing up a little bit, like I just loved camping. I grew up camping with my family. That was like our go-to vacation as a kid. And then, in the sort of middle teenage years or whatever, you have the stereotypical rebellion, but sort of fell back in love with it in early adulthood and just really enjoyed it. And the more I camped, I was like, well, what if I could go to every single national park? What if it just, I'm very goal oriented, for better or for worse at times. I don't know if you can see behind me, there's a map, and I have little push pins of all the places I've camped and stuff like that. So, awesome. I'm kind of a collector in that way, I guess, or an archivist. But yeah, so there was just more and more things I wanted to do. And I don't know if you're like this at all, but I can sort of be very critical and harsh on myself, but also very supportive at the same time. So like when I looked at my physical health and my ability, like I never beat myself up, but I also recognize that like this is not where I want to be in order to do the things I want to do. And so essentially just, made the decision of, hey, if I really want to do some of these things, like I still want to hike the Grand Canyon, never done that. The permit system's a little rough, but, like all these things. And I was just like, let me just do this. In the back of my mind, I was like, this could make an interesting story since I work in, podcasting and writing and entertainment and stuff like that. I was like, there might be something here. And so, like you said, I put a date on the calendar. I was like, this will be a great motivation to help me sort of get to where I want to be. And yeah, I ended up losing 100 pounds. I did the hike, spoiler. But obviously that there's more to the story than that. And, like so many things, it's, like you plan to do one thing, but all the tangents that teach you things along the way are part of the, I guess, fun of it.
Yeah. What's really interesting to me is your story. As I was listening to it, it wasn't until this morning I was like, dang, this is so much like a program we did this year called the 100-Mile Challenge, which is essentially we sold some beta slots to our followers, our members. Mm-hmm. And then we gave them like a framework that step by step took them how to train, how to prepare, and how to execute a 100-mile hike. And it was a really powerful thing. in the sense that everyone that did it had really positive things to say about the program. But two, for me, I got a lot of feedback and like felt very, I don't know, charged by it. Because a lot of times I'm working through a computer, I'm working, I'm interacting in that way. And this was more interactive. And so I got a lot out of it personally. And so we're totally planning on doing it. And I was like, holy cow, he just did like his own 100-mile challenge. And so my question, I guess, to that is like, how did you begin to prepare yourself? Like, did you have like mileage goals that you were trying to track? Did you have weight loss goals you're trying to track? Were you, like what steps along the way? Because you picked this, it was almost a year out. Is that right?
Yeah, pretty much exactly a year. Yeah.
So when you picked that, like, was there milestones you were pushing for, or is it just like get in the best shape I can before the year's up?
Yes and no. A little bit of both, I guess. I had some success with sort of, losing weight or sort of getting strong before, but up and down a bit. So it's like, I knew I was capable of making some change. I didn't know how much. And then at the same time, like, I was already pretty active for a person of my size. I was already hiking pretty regularly. Obviously on vacation, if we're going camping somewhere, car camping somewhere, would, look for decent length hikes, not just the quarter mile ones near the visitor center, but, getting out as close to the backcountry as possible. I live near Griffith Park in Los Angeles, which is a great city park that has some decent, elevation gains and stuff like that. So I thought, okay, this is possible. I've had some success in the past. And so what I found hugely helpful and motivational to me is like, one is just having a very set goal that you're aiming for. That has its disadvantages too, because if you can't reach your goal, it can be very disheartening.
Yeah.
But the other thing, like you mentioned, if I had certain mileage goals or whatever, is, we live in the smartwatch Fitbit era, and just being able to track things, again, has its downsides, can be disheartening if you're not seeing the progress you want, but it's finding one or two or three things that you can track where you can see process. For some people, that's stepping on a scale every day. Mm-hmm. And if you can see those incremental changes. For other people, that's too much. And it's, so that worked for me, but I know that doesn't work for everyone. And then another huge one is just the whole, like, if I'm getting steps or miles or hiking, like, can I just do a little bit more than I did the day before? Can I do a little bit more than I did the week before? I ended up starting jogging through this, which I'd never done, and was doing, 3 miles almost every day. And then would do I got up to doing 10 miles, which is, I mean, not very fast. Some people might walk faster than I was jogging. But again, it was just having these things where it's just like, what can I track that I can see progress in, and how can I just do a little bit more each time?
Right. Yeah. It's funny. We're very similar in, I think, the goal oriented side of things. I like to set really big goals and work for a long time at them. And I do get pretty crushed when things don't go the way that you want them to. But also, even like the watch, like for me, I'm not really an Apple user, but I got a Garmin watch, and I started because I tried to like run or be active outside for training, but I ended up just kept defaulting back to the gym.
Yeah.
And it was because I felt like I could just see the progress easier. And so when I got a watch that I was tracking mileage and like seeing my weekly mileage number and just stuff like that, I started to gamify it. And it definitely changed it for me, where that progress and being able to track that progress was helpful, right? There's no progress if you can't track it. Tracking it is
well,
the only way you can see progress.
I forget who said it, but I heard someone say like measurement is motivation. And like, stop trying to find like the mythical, magical, aha inspiration moment, and just focus on measurement, because actually seeing progress, even if it's, 1% more or less than that more, is just hugely motivating.
Totally. So as you're preparing for this, what was like the biggest, what was like the best thing you did in preparations for this? Like if you had one key takeaway, like this was the best thing I did.
It was pretty fun. Like I said, still to this day, I go car camping. Actually, I just got back from, my girlfriend and I, Rocky, we drove up to Alaska in August and camped along the way. So it's like,
wow,
that's still a huge joy of mine. But this was my first time. And so the training for the JMT was in 2019, the end of 2018, a little bit, I think, if I remember correctly. It doesn't feel that long ago. I'm getting older, right. Must be. So this, I had never been backpacking before. So I really enjoyed a lot of just, again, living in Southern California, living in Los Angeles, a lot of people just only think of it as the city, but we have some pretty cool mountain ranges that aren't, an hour or less outside of the city, and just getting out and exploring and backpacking sometimes by myself, just in some of these prep hikes was really, really fun and really cool. There's this cool place called Henninger Flats, which I guess most recently was used as to grow pine trees and study how they affect in forest fires. But a lot of this San Bernardino and closer mountain ranges here aren't too piney in some of the lower elevations. So it's just this really cool place. I was a 3-mile hike up, and they have a bunch of campgrounds and a bathroom, and sometimes have running water. So it was a very easy entry level hike, but it's also close, and it was really beautiful, and it just had these amazing views of sort of various downtowns in Southern California. So that was a really cool place.
Yeah. Those shakeouts are so critical, and I think you can't train and not do the shakeouts, or do the shakeout trips and not train, because they really do go so hand in hand, because it just takes anything. It takes an injury, or it takes mentally checking out, because you're not prepared mentally.
I had never camped alone before. So that's, I did a lot of these with my partner as well, but just even doing that was growing and both difficult at times, but also really special experience.
Yeah. It's, I think for me, I never had that, solo issue, but I've been around friends and stuff that enough people that I've seen that it's always surprising, right? Because for some reason, being alone in the woods, can really trigger things for people. And I think easing into that is definitely critical, but I think it's not even rational fear, I guess. Sometimes it's more the unknowns, right? And so I think the more unknowns you can eliminate, the more comfortable you are in those scenarios. So car camping, and then being a mile from your car, and then 3 miles from your car, and pretty soon you're in the middle of the wilderness, camping solo. But so you're gearing up for this. As you're gearing up for all this, and again, I kind of went this way, but I want to come back to it really quick before we get into the actual meat and potatoes of the story, which is, what were you hoping to get from doing this? Was it purely I want this badge of I've hiked the JMT, or was there something else that you felt was pulling you to go do this?
No, that's a great question. I think on the surface, I'm very much motivated by checking something off the list, peak bagging, sort of
totally.
This is cool. Not very many people get to see this or experience this. Sometimes I'm a little bit more motivated than I want to be, but there was a huge part of it that was just the challenge of it. Am I capable of doing this? I think we can be very limiting on ourselves and sort of settle. And that has its, I understand why. There's a lot of things going on. There's a lot of stress and complexities happen. And sort of as a defense to that, we may settle in certain areas to excel in others, oversimplified. But so a big part of it was also just sort of challenging myself. Is this a possibility? Is this picture of who I think I want to be? One, do I even want to be that person? Let me try it. And secondly, am I capable of it?
Yeah. Why do you think we as humans, or maybe it's just me and you, I don't know, are just so fascinated with hard things? It just seems like we're fascinated to watch other people do hard things, but we're also really interested in pushing our own limits. For me, it's kind of the same thing. I started trail running this last year, and I did my first ever organized race, right? And it was a 45-mile race through from ranging from 10 to 12,000 feet in elevation. You're just climbing and descending at that elevation. It was absolutely brutal. And as I was running, I started the runoff, and by like mile 16, I was having these issues, and I was so frustrated because I'm like, I'm just not a runner. Like, I'm just not built to be a runner. And I thought, I'm like, so why do I do this? Why am I dead set on improving at running?
Mm-hmm.
And I just thought, I think I do it because I'm bad at it. Like for some reason, I'm interested in improving, whether it's the things I'm good at or the things I'm bad at, and doing hard things. And for some reason, I think I'm fascinated with it. And I think other people are too, right? Like, they see other people go do amazing things, and it's just fascinating. So I wonder if a part of that was what you're feeling, and if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I know what I'm about to say is definitely true for me. I like to think it's true for others, but I'm not others. But I just feel like there's so many things that are out of control in our lives, and I don't like being out of control. That's where stress comes in. That's where anxiety comes in, even where regret comes in, and sort of all these feelings. And so pushing ourselves to, to do difficult things, strenuous things, like planning this hike, I think there's very much this is something that is out of control that I can more safely try versus, and it's sort of, and obviously there are the dangers, but I don't know if that's making sense, but sort of there's enough constraints, like there's enough known about attempting a really long through hike if you've never done it before, that it's not complete chaos. So there are some bumpers on the bowling lane, to use a metaphor, but you still have to try and knock the pins down. And so, yeah, it's like this weird mix of it's difficult, it's challenging, it's out of our control, but there are some reins, mixing metaphors. There are some guides that can sort of make it feel a little bit more doable and safe. And I think that's also why we love watching people do. I mean, like Free Solo was a huge movie. And I think people look at this ultra chaotic world and go, if this person can do that, maybe we're not as out of control as we think.
Yeah. Or we're completely reckless. One of the two. That's what I get when I watch Free Solo. Holy cow.
Well, but I think that goes hand in hand. Like, this is a completely reckless thing that he was able to do. And so maybe the world isn't as scary as it is. Now, that may be a false belief, and we may just sort of...
Well, to him, I think he does feel like he's in control, right? Like, he's living his best life when he's on that mountain, and he feels in control, and he's just walking that line for him.
And I think that rush he gets from doing it, and rush might be the wrong word, but the reason he keeps doing it is because it is one of those things where it feels like, you're sort of chipping away at the chaos that's around us one little bit at a time. Yeah.
You touched on this a little bit in one of your podcasts that I was listening to, which was just this concept of pain, and how pain, can actually like make you feel alive, if that makes sense, or like be a touch point. Right. And I think there's something to that, in the sense of, because of the chaotic, crazy world that we live in, and because there's so many variables and things like that sometimes when you're on trail, that even experiencing pain makes you feel more present than you can be anywhere else, if that makes sense. Like, you can just be just there. I'm just hiking down this trail. I'm just looking around, and I'm just feeling this pain after a certain amount of miles, right?
Well, life is more simple on trail. Like, even if you have a lot of stuff waiting for you when you get back, there's only so much you can do in that moment. You can only take another step to get to camp. If you're in the middle of somewhere, like, you're half as far away as getting, you're often days away from returning back, even if you wanted to exit early. So it's like, there's only 4 or 5 things that you have to do every single day. And that definitely helps you sort of focus on the present. And I think experiencing pain, experiencing joy, experiencing grief, like, all these things sort of continue to point you in that place when you're out in the middle of nowhere.
Totally. Yeah. I think there's a tremendous amount of power in being present like that, and not being able to check out and to numb out on tech or whatever it is, and just and being helpless too, being able to do anything about your to-do list or your stresses.
In the first season of Trail Wait, there's an episode, and we talk about like the healing power of nature, for lack of a better term.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a reason people with PTSD like go through outdoor therapy. You hear all these stories of soldiers who return home and do the AT or the PCT, and there's a reason why. It's sort of, I don't have PTSD, but I have whatever my cushy, privileged city version of that is. And so I experience the same benefits on a smaller scale.
Right. Totally. So let's jump into this. So you start the JMT, you're hiking with your partner, Rocky, right?
Yeah.
And, you set out, and what are the first couple days like? Are you feeling like I got this, or are you feeling like, what did I just start?
No, I definitely got disheartened, discouraged pretty soon. I was throughout a lot of the hike, honestly, like I thought I was further along than I actually was. And that was pretty difficult to sort of wrestle with. I do think, if maybe this is just an excuse, but I do think I had some altitude sickness related stuff. I had a pretty gnarly like wheezing when I was breathing, the day 2 and 3 or something like that. But that's part of life, and that's part of being out there, is sort of assessing where you're at and sort of going, okay, is this good? Is this safe? Do we need to turn back? Do we need to push? Do we need to do an alternate route, et cetera? So I definitely had a lot of those experiences definitely in the first week, but in the first few days as well.
Yeah, altitude sickness is no joke. I take it very seriously after I've had altitude sickness. And I feel like I'm susceptible to it almost, because typically going into it, it's stress. It can be from stress on the body, work stress, et cetera, or you starting off, the trail being, slightly overweight, and like that's going to be additional stress that at altitude just compounds, right? And so that's actually really impressive. Did you end up dropping any elevation when the wheezing started to go away? Like, did you go into a town or anything like that, or did it just go away on its own?
No, we did. We did do some. I'm trying to not give away spoilers if people still wanted to listen to the first season.
And let me say this too, really quick. Andrew's podcast is not to like an interview style podcast per se, like ours, or just like where we're doing stuff ourselves. He's telling very much the season. He does it in seasons where he's telling a story throughout the entire season. So each episode is more like a season you'd watch like on Netflix or something like that. So it is very much worth going and listening through his podcast to hear just the art of you telling that story, but you bring in all sorts of, you bring in little guests and little sound bites here and there that really add a lot to the story.
Yeah,
so
we recorded a lot during
story.
the hike as well, and stuff like that. But so we did have to do some detours and do some alternate stuff. We never went, like when I was starting to feel that, because I don't know if it was altitude sickness or not. I just know I was having trouble breathing, and I had like this wheezy thing, and I had congestion. Now that could have been some sort of cold type thing that was made worse by the altitude, or that could have been the altitude caused it. I mean, definitely my fitness level wasn't helping that, but as we say in the show too, like there is still this sort of mystery around altitude sickness, and it can affect people who are pros who've never had it before, or it can affect people like me. But that was a very good lesson to learn too. And of just sort of like sometimes like taking the detour isn't a failure, and that's okay. And so that's what a big focus of that episode happens to be about.
Yeah. So tell me about your hardest day on trail.
It's probably that day. I mean, I guess I can say it's not, I don't really believe too much in spoilers. That's a whole other tangent to say I don't believe in spoilers, but I don't think it ruins the experience as much as we hype it up to do. So we started on the south. We did the JMT from south to north, which means that we summit Mount Whitney, within the first few days.
Right.
And this is when I was really struggling, and it was early on in the trip. I was having trouble, and it was one of those things where it was like, do we push through and do this and potentially something horrible happen, or just, sort of will the strenuous nature of this ruin the rest of the trip or make us have to cut short if there's not like a catastrophic thing? And yeah, so that was probably the toughest day for me, was just the physical stress of doing that, plus the emotional stress of realizing I'm not going to be able to summit Mount Whitney. And is this technically a through hike if I don't walk every single, mile of it by foot, and all those, sort of dumb scorecard things that us humans do, the ego gets in the way. There were some other tough days. There was an experience with some injuries and a hiker that sort of fell off trail and had to be evacuated. And so that's more the emotional sort of stress. I don't know if it was me sort of putting that out of my mind and not focusing on that or not dealing with it. Maybe I still haven't dealt with it, but like that was definitely more difficult for Rocky than it was for me. And then dealing with post-holing for the first time was definitely a challenge too. And really learning, okay, this is important. What time of day you plan to hit this?
Yeah.
It's like, they're over exaggerating. No, they're not.
So tons of people start off on trails to only find out that they're not willing to do it or can't do it. Right. I can't speak necessarily a ton through hikers of the AT or PCT and stuff, but there's a large percentage of them that don't make it out of the first 100 miles or the first 2 weeks. And I think it shocks them, even though they know the statistic, right? So for you coming into this and kind of starting with perhaps maybe a harder part of the trail, going straight up Mount Whitney like that, why do you feel like you decided to keep going forward?
I think, a part of it was just like, I've already like, quote unquote, sold this podcast. So it's like there was a little bit of that, or the shame and embarrassment. We talk a lot about this concept of an inciting incident, which is like a storytelling technique. But, as my friend says, sometimes if there's a river that you need to cross, throw your boots over it first. And you're like, well, I have to cross it now because that's where my boots are. So
you feel pretty committed.
I think that was a huge part of it. I think the other thing too is, I was subconsciously learning then, but definitely it became more concrete once I got home. But just like a change isn't a failure. Like a detour isn't a failure. An adaptation isn't a failure. And so often we can put that high stress on ourselves. But I think maybe more to get at what you were saying too. Like I truly believe anyone who can walk can do the JMT. It's going to be a lot harder for some people and it's going to be a lot easier for others. But the most difficult part is not the physical action of walking and hiking and climbing elevation and going down. I think it's so much the mental game. And that's the stuff that's hardest to prepare for. As we say in the podcast, there aren't gyms for your mind unless that's what therapy is. But I think some therapists might take offense to that.
All right. But you can build, I would say you could build an arsenal of experiences of
totally.
That was a little, I trained myself to do hard. If you're looking at it from your own perspective of the more hard things I do, the better I get at doing hard things. Right. And I think there's a massive element to that. And I think it doesn't have to be like doing a massive JMT experience. It can be line upon line. Right.
100%.
But I feel like I need your wisdom in the sense of how do I find more, for instance, with that ultra that I ran. So I finished the ultra and I finished it in
congratulations,
bad position, I guess you could say, meaning
you finished it though.
I finished it. Right. But I didn't finish at the time I wanted. And I finished really dehydrated, had facial twitching and a lisp and stuff. I was in bad position. But I finished it. I felt very accomplished for a day. And then the next day I was like, I need to run that again. And I need to run it the way that I wanted to run it, if that makes sense. I just instantly leap forward to the next thing. And I really wish that I could stop and enjoy things a little bit more and just be accomplished with that. And I think there's a lot of value in that. It's really interesting to watch the members that were doing the 100-mile challenge, because of the beta group that we took into that program this year. Well over the majority didn't do the 100 miles, but they all came back and found, these big positives out of the experience, which I found very impressive. And just that a lot of them start off with this goal, and they'd like post in our closed Facebook group saying like, this was the goal. This is how it planned out. I was disappointed, but then I'm super happy about it all in the end. Right. And I think there's a lot of learning, I think, for some people that I think that comes naturally. And for others like me, it's I just instantly leap forward to the next thing way too fast. Right.
Yeah. There was definitely some days on the JMT where I was like planning the next through hike, and it's just like, no, like be here now.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. So what was your best day on trail?
There were some pretty special days sort of in the last week where, because we skipped Whitney, we could readjust some of the mileage on other days and sort of really enjoy. We skipped Whitney, and then we added one more day. I forget why off the top of my head, but so we ended up actually so we could sort of, and we were, at the peak of our fitness level by then. So it's just like getting to camp early, enjoying these amazing views that are just, it's the Sierras, which is already one of the most beautiful places. It's, even the developed areas of the Sierras, like Yosemite Valley, are known for their beauty, even though they're filled with cars and stuff like that, there's a lot of ugly cars out there. So that was definitely it. I mean, there's the cliche of like the Neros of like, getting into Red's Meadow and like eating a hamburger that honestly, I don't think is that anything special. It's not a bad hamburger, but just then it felt amazing,
Right. Totally.
Showering after, however many days, 7-8 days, in the backcountry. So just things like that. I mean, trying to think if there's like a specific moment. Honestly, walking down, this was a bittersweet moment. I think the sort of last 3 or so miles walking down into Yosemite Valley, and just more and more people show up, and that definitely takes you aback, and you're like, this is kind of weird and strange after seeing, maybe 3 people a day, but also like having accomplished this goal. And then there was the people just didn't give you a second thought, but there was one older couple who like saw our big packs and saw us posing for a picture by like there's like a mileage sign, because it's like a trailhead that has multiple trails, and so like we were getting a picture pointing to the JMT mileage, and they're like, "Did you just do that?" And I'm like, "Yeah," and they're like, "Whoa, that's so cool!" And like that was like a really special moment.
Yeah, was there a moment when you realized that you were gonna finish, like you were like, I'm for sure gonna, like, you know what I mean? It's always like the goal is to finish, but then there's usually a moment where you're like, we're gonna do this, like we've crossed this specific threshold where you're like, it's happening.
I think definitely after our first sort of resupply, I was pretty sure. There was this interesting thing that happened, and then I learned doing this with my partner, where Rocky was less prepared in a sense that, I mean, she's way more fit than I am, and has done, she used to run, cross country and things like that. But like I spent way too much time. I mean, this is live ultralight, like just obsessing about every little detail, like trying different shoes, switching to different shoes, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so like she had hiking boots that were fine and good for when we would just go out, but they started falling apart. She's getting blisters on her feet, and I just felt really bad. But long story short, she would start being like, I don't want to be here. Why are we out here? This is ridiculous, especially after the encounter with the fallen hiker and stuff like that, where it was just like, why are we out here? And I instantly went into fix it mode. I was like, okay, where's the nearest exit? Let's get out of here. And just learning, like, all those feelings are real and valid, obviously, but it's like she didn't actually want to leave.
Yeah.
And so there was a couple of moments along there where I was just like, okay, this could be the end of it, and that's fine. But I really think after that first resupply, after the first week or whatever, 5 days, I was just like, I can do this. We can get done.
Yeah. Yeah, that's awesome. Well, you bring up kind of obsessing over equipment and gear, and I mean, personally, I think you're totally validated in that. I obsess over gear so much, and shoes and all of that, right? Because it can all make a massive difference, right? Like a bad pair of shoes and whatnot can end a hike, or so on and so forth. So I'm curious, do you know like what you started the trail off with, like your base weight or just even your pack weight?
I mean, still right now, honestly, I didn't realize I was as ultralight as I was. The joke on the JMT is because, there's often PCTers who have, a grocery bag as their backpack on their back. And then you have these, retirees who have these, huge buses on their back. And so we were somewhere in the middle. I think base weight was around 12 or 13 pounds, so not too bad. And I think I'm still right around there now. I mean, maybe dropped a pound on it. I'm still a pretty big guy, even though I lost weight, and so just there's more fabric, even on the lightweight fabric. So and then the whole 10-pound thing is kind of arbitrary anyway. But I'm always looking on how to I'm at the point where it's just like I don't need to buy any more stuff. Like I'm just adding to landfills. Like let me at least wear something out before I replace it.
Totally. Yeah. I get that a lot where people will get obsessed with people's gear lists. Like, oh, this guy had a 9-pound gear list, and like, it'll get a lot of views on YouTube or this, that, and the other. But for me, I think, it's like, that's just not realistic because where I live, I'm going to need a warmer sleeping bag. I'm 6'2", so I need, the tall versions of things and all those things. And it all adds up to where I sit most of the time. My base weight is between 10 and 12 pounds. And I think it's, a really great spot to be, honestly. It's like, if I can get it down to 10 pounds, half the time I'll be like, okay, now I can add one luxury item. Maybe I'll that's a chair on this one. Or
that's what I was going to say. Like,
pole.
That's the one thing I missed the most was a chair with a back.
Really?
So like my whole thing is just like, how can I lighten this to add, one of those 1-pound chairs to it.
Yeah. What do you feel like was the most important piece of gear that you brought? Like, what was like a piece that really stood out to you on trail?
So in a couple of my practice hikes, I had, a decent, Big Agnes synthetic mummy bag. And I've never been a big sleeping bag fan. And so I didn't even know about quilts until after I'd already made that purchase. And Big Agnes helped us out too, with some gear and stuff like that. So it was also fortuitous in that sense. Yeah. But sort of after some of those hikes, I was just like, this isn't working. I got to figure out a better sleep thing. And I ended up getting, Z-Pack's quilt, and that was a total game changer. And now even when we're car camping and stuff, we'll use those more often than not.
Yeah. Yeah. So interesting. I've seen it both ways where people can't get used to the quilts, and I'm like in love with quilts, I guess.
Well, I like sleeping on my stomach. I like sleeping on my side. I move around a lot. And the part of it, this is just finding what is for you. But I think that sleeping bag was probably my most important piece of gear.
Yeah. That's awesome. Well, you finished the hike. I think you already mentioned that, so I'm not spoiling anything here, but I think people should absolutely go listen to the Journey Along the Way. I think it's one of those styles of podcasts that would be great to just download the whole season before you go on your own hike or do as your training.
I definitely, I did that with a lot of audiobooks and stuff like that. I think I've listened to every audiobook of someone's, PCT or AT journey, and then some of the lesser known trails as well. I find it super inspirational.
Yeah. So I'd urge people to go do that. Listen to it when you're out on trail, and you've got another season coming up as well, right? Maybe give us a 10,000 foot view of what's coming in this season.
Yeah. So this one is definitely a bit more of like an emotional sequel than like an actual part 2. And we get into that in the first episode. Part of that is just through whether it was pandemic or wildfire season in California, like plans changed and couldn't necessarily do what we wanted to do. Fingers crossed, we actually are thinking about doing the Camino de Santiago next year, and that might be a season 3 if we get renewed. But so everyone go listen. Yeah, but season 2, it's sort of taking these concepts we talked about in season 1. So trail weight, obviously there was the physical weight on my body that I was listening, but there was a lot of like emotional weight, emotional baggage that we talked about. We've talked a little about that today. And then there's also this concept of like the weight of being a responsible outdoors person. And what is our impact on these places? And if we love these and we recreate in these areas, you know, are we loving these places to death? And so really taking that concept for season 2 and chronicling my experience sort of discovering and then learning about Walt Disney's attempt to build a ski park in Mineral King in the Sierras. And it's a really fascinating story. Just if you like history or theme parks and stuff like that, there's a lot of really interesting tidbits. But also, it's a great example of sort of our shifting views on environmentalism, on how we use the land, and how we preserve it, how we recreate in it. And I've learned a lot along the way. But just, you know, from it being this great big idea that everyone supported, Walt Disney considered himself, you know, an environmentalist. He got awards from the Sierra Club. I think he was like an honorary member, if I remember correctly, to sort of getting stuck in development hell, to then being opposed by environmentalists, to then going to the Supreme Court and creating this landmark. You know, as one of the guests says in this season, the Supreme Court case that sort of came from this is the most underappreciated environmental case in history. And it's had such amazing impacts because part of it really questions, does nature have rights? Like, you know, the Lorax, Dr. Seuss famous line, like, who will speak for the trees? But that's a really interesting question. And I know I don't have an answer. And so that's part of why I wanted to do this season of like, what does it mean to be a responsible outdoors person? Like, is it, you know, like I mentioned, I just drove to Alaska, and was that a bad idea? Am I polluting the world? Am I destroying these beautiful places that I'm visiting? And sort of wrestling with these questions. And then along the way, you know, I spent some time in the Sierras and Mineral King. You know, I talk about other hikes I'm on. I talk with historians and experts and journalists and stuff along the way.
Yeah. It sounds very fascinating to me. It's something that I also think about a lot. I've never been on the JMT, but I've even heard things like, you know, parts of the JMT are so well used and loved that like they're not the same, or so on and so forth, right? And so
when the trail itself has been adjusted over the years too, like so you might be walking down a part of it that wasn't the quote unquote original part of it as well too, because that other place just got too much foot traffic. Right.
Yeah, it is a very fascinating question, and it'd be interesting to hear your take, especially where you're saying like you're not necessarily strong on one side, right? Because you know, if you completely not use it, right, like then the natural resources and whatnot that are available to us to go and enjoy, then what's the point of it? But also, you know, you do see the degrade, you know, over time, and that's really disheartening as well. And so it's interesting. It's quite the thing to wrestle with.
Well, and one of the things we sort of scratched the surface on in the first season is even the concept of wilderness and how that's kind of a manufactured thing. Because if you look at like people have been living all over the world for a long time, and people live differently than we live today. And so like a lot of indigenous people throughout the Sierras, because that's where I spent time, you know, would manage it. You know, I think a lot of people maybe have heard about how in Yosemite Valley, you know, they would set fires to sort of keep the grass and brush at a certain level and sort of manage it and garden in these areas. So then when white settlers first came there and they like, this is an amazing wild place. It's like, well, it is a beautiful place, but it was also taken care of and almost gardened to look a certain way. And so there are a lot of these questions about like use, overuse, And so much of our preservation in the past has been sort of like just hitting pause. And it's just like, well, what era do you hit pause on? Like, do you try to restore it how it was 100 years ago, 200 years ago, 1,000 years ago, or do you try to pause it how it is today? And it
gets more and more complicated too, because I grew up a sportsman, right? And so I've watched animal herds rise and fall, and we have this massive issue really where you've got basically humans has this massive impact of we're taking over wintering lands, we're destroying travel corridors, we're doing all these things, but we're also like the apex predator. And then we like we're reintroducing other apex predators, wolves and grizzlies, and then all that just flows down to where like deer herds are minuscule compared to what they've been, and where are they going to go, right? Because we're still doing what we're doing, and anyways, it just gets more and more and more complicated, because just like you say, well, what? Because the people that are, let's say, arguing to bring back in wolves and grizzlies and stuff like that, it's like, well, we need to bring them back because we pushed them out. Totally true, but at the same time, like what happens when you do that? And where, like you say, where do you push pause? Do you push pause on after you pushed them out? Do you push pause on this or this? Because no matter how it is,
or do you never push pause?
Or do you never push pause?
This is, is all of California going to go up in fire? And is that should it? Is that, that's the nature? Should we try to put up,
why do we fight forest fires?
Yeah, there's still a huge, I don't know when the last time you were in Yosemite or if you ever been, but there's, still a lot of people who are mad that they sort of let those fires burn as much as they did and think they did the wrong decision. And there's other people who are like, no, this is a fire ecology. This is a normal cycle of it. Like, yes, let's, and then there's the whole argument. Well, we've let them overgrow because we hit pause. And so the fire's worse. And I think it's one of these things, not as a cop out, but as a truly like life lesson, is like sometimes asking the questions is the most important part. Yeah. And continuing to ask questions. And, this is probably more cliche than fact, but it is one of those things too, where it's like, if you're not changing your mind about something every year, like you're probably not listening, not learning, not hearing other perspectives as much as you should.
Yeah. That's such a great way to say it too, is the people that again, opinions involved here, that I think are the most wrong are the ones that never adapt their opinions. That they, sometimes you come to like, middle of rural Utah, and the people you grew up around have this opinion, and it never changes because they're like, the opinions around them never change, and they don't necessarily travel out and see other parts of the world to have that. And they're just not commingling with other opinions enough, right? They get in their own little tight, small towns.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, like, while I can totally see what they're saying and stuff, it's like, but that's not the reality of the world we live in now. Right. And so adapting and changing, I think that's really well said, that if your opinions aren't constantly adapting and changing, that you're probably getting it wrong,
and
right?
Obviously there are exceptions to that, but yeah, it's just one of these things where it's just like, ask the questions at the very least, listen to more people. I think in metaphors a lot, maybe that's the storyteller in me, but sort of a concept that has stuck with me over the years is like, if you want to paint the most accurate picture possible, you have to look at an item from multiple perspectives, multiple views. That's what 3D is versus 2D. So if you only have one or two perspectives on something, it's going to be much flatter. But the more angles, the more perspectives, the more voices you get in, the more complete picture you're going to have. And I think the same is true, obviously, in all of this. Like, let's hear all these different stuff. Let's bring in all this information. Let's continue to study new stuff, but let's look back at traditional things as well, and sort of how do we move forward? And let's make mistakes and learn and adjust.
Yeah. I'm so in Utah, I would say that Patagonia is not the most popular company at all times, but at the same time, there's so much that I see in the good that a company can do. And we haven't discussed this on the podcast yet. So interesting enough that last week, Patagonia basically announced that Yvon Chouinard, the owner of Patagonia, basically signed it over to a couple different trusts and entities that will now run Patagonia as the sole owners and donate massive amounts of profits. Basically, all profits coming from Patagonia going forward will be donated into these what are called 501c3 organizations that just donate the money into climate control and things like that Patagonia believes in. But I don't know, did you see that news announced last week?
Well, that's I think this is a great example to bring up what we're talking about, because like I'm a Patagonia fan. I think, you know, what they like, the quality of their stuff is great. They're, you know, a B corporation. They're 1% for the planet. They're pretty much created the organic cotton movement, which now pretty much all our clothes are done. You know, they've done some really cool things, but and obviously, like, I'm all for more money going into these areas, but there's also been a really interesting counter debate, which I think is very valid. It's just like, why does he get to choose what organizations get the money? Like, shouldn't this be democratic? Wouldn't it be better? Wow. Wouldn't it be better if it stayed a company and all that money went into our taxes, and then us, the voters, could decide on how to use that better? Like, shouldn't it be more democratic? And I think that's a really valid point. I think I see both sides to it. Truly, I truly do. There's the quote unquote, like, how do you do good today while still being able to adapt and change for the good tomorrow? Because part of what he said was like even if the next person who takes over this company shares the same values, even if the next person after that, you know, like, how long down the line, whether it's a public company or it gets, you know, I give it to my kids and then they give it to their kids, like, what if future generations have different values than what we do? Like, I think it's a totally valid concern, but at the same time, what if the companies that he's giving all this money to, like, what if we learn new approaches to help, and this trust is stuck giving this money to this other stuff? I think there's an interesting thing there where, again, I think this is a good thing in the long run. Like, if I just had to give my 2 cents, which I don't have to, but I am, because I'm on a podcast. That's what we share our you know, uninformed opinions. That's what podcasting is. But yeah, that's a great example of, like, let's keep asking these questions and let's go, like, is this actually good? Is this a good idea? Maybe it is for today, but it might not be for tomorrow.
Yeah. I think I'm always just inspired by what good a company can do.
Totally.
Obviously, there's lots of companies that can be the opposite and be destructive, right? But it's really cool to see a company, whether you agree with everything they do or you don't, their style, whatever. But, like, it's cool to see that a company can have that much power and sway. And yeah, I mean, just to weigh in on that too, like, I think it would be great if democracy would allow that to work in the way that it should. But unfortunately, there's so much in between there and where it would get back to. I mean, it's the same thing, like, why
democracies can also do bad things.
Yeah. And, like, why are national parks broke when everyone's in them, right? Like, there's all these things that's like, that I think it's cool that they can kind of step around, and hopefully the way that they set those entities up, you know, for years and maybe, you know, centuries, that it'll continue to do good for people. But it's really cool. If you haven't looked into it, maybe just go look it up. It's an interesting concept of what they've tried to form, as far as just having two governing entities that now manage Patagonia and allocate the profits to giving back to the world. So,
and this is a concept that we explore in season 2 as well, sort of like, do you use the systems in place to try to address the issues? Or do you say the systems might be broken, and so maybe you need to tear, like sometimes you need to take all the furniture out of the house and figure out what you want to keep, how you want to organize things. And sometimes you're like, no, we got to tear down the house and build a new one. And so, like, again, I think on the same theme, it's just sort of keep asking these questions. Like, don't let asking questions prevent you from, like, doing something, but also don't let your sort of decision to do something let you stop asking questions.
Totally. Well, Andrew, it has been an absolute privilege to have you on the podcast. I've really enjoyed your Ultralight podcast. I need to go and finish it myself. So now you've spoiled it. Now I know you finish it, but, you know, and I look forward to this next season that you've got coming out. That comes out in about a month. Is that correct?
Yeah, October. I should have the date right in front of me, but I don't. October 17th.
Okay, so you have just under a month. Probably from when this is published, it'll be, you know, weeks away. So make sure you're subscribed to his podcast. Go check it out. Learn more. Keep an open mind. I think it's good for everybody. I know I'd like to have more of an open mind, and also just I think we're getting to the point with Outer Vitals where it's advantageous for us to figure out more ways to give back and to help and figure out our voice and how we can have an impact as a company as well. So,
and
really
just real quick,
yeah.
Sorry, just on that note
good.
too, like in the spirit of this conversations, like there might be things in there that I disagree with years from now. And so if you disagree with the stuff you hear, I don't think there's anything too controversial. I honestly don't remember, but like, that's okay to disagree with it, but instead of using that as a place to sort of draw lines in the sand, like research it for yourself, listen to other opinions. If you can constructively and lovingly disagree with someone and enter into that conversation, I think that's a great place to start.
Totally. And I'm sure the way that you're going to tell those stories will be, in the style that it makes it easy to just consume that and think, right? You're a guy who likes to ask those questions that make you ponder. And I'm sure that's what that podcast will be about. So,
and hopefully I'll take the critique and I'll take the loss and hopefully I'll be the first to say I was wrong.
That's the nature of it. Anytime you create something, you're creating an opportunity or a target for other people to fire at you, but also, you're creating, like, the world's going to change. And so not all information stays relevant forever. So I think that's a good place to be, but really appreciate it, Andrew. Again, for those of you that are tuning into this podcast, have not yet left us a review, please go leave us a review. It does help us get ranked and found, and so that people can hear these types of conversations and hopefully be inspired as I've been, Andrew, in your story and getting out on trail. Real quick, is there any other areas or places that people can get in contact with you that you'd like to throw out there?
Yeah, I mean, we have a website, trailweight.co. That's probably going to have most of the information. Social media, Trailweight or Andrew Steven, Steven. I'm not super active on social media, but we try to, at least when we're publishing episodes, try to post some pictures and other sort of behind the scenes, for lack of a better term, content along the way. Okay.
And very last question here. If you could go back and give yourself or someone in your same situation a word of advice from back in, 2018, before you'd done the John Muir Trail, what would you tell yourself?
Get in therapy.
Yeah.
Yeah. Whether it's some form, I do think formal therapy is important, but just
totally
be in places where you can sort of explore your interior with the same passion that many of us, I'm assuming, who listen to this have for exploring the exterior world.
Yeah. It was fascinating when I went and did a section of trail on the Appalachian Trail this year. There's a lot of trail magic, right? So that's where people are bringing in food or making meals for people, et cetera. And so many of those are put on by the local churches because people get out on trail and they start to ask those questions. It's like they finally get enough clarity and enough noise out of their minds that they start to ask those questions and start to learn about themselves, per se. And I think trail is a great way to do that. But I would also agree. I think therapy for anyone and everyone is worth doing, whether you think you've got issues, whether you don't think you've got issues, whether they're clear to other people. Everyone has to learn how to process things. And I would second that. I think, like you say, go to a counselor and spend time, and then go out on trail and process yourself. So,
is this where you segue into an ad for BetterHelp or what are those?
I don't actually know. They've never sponsored me. I've just spent my own money on therapy. You know what I mean? And learned, and every time I've done it, I've grown from it. And whether that's in my marriage, whether that's just me personally learning things that are right in front of your face that you can't see, you know what I'm saying? And so, yeah, BetterHelp, if you're listening, you can sponsor the podcast next time. So, well, I appreciate it, Andrew. Again,
Thank
everyone
so
go
much.
check out his podcast, and hopefully we'll have you on in the future. I'd like to hear how the next trail you do goes. So
thank you so much.